Hello guys, welcome to my tutorial, and in this tutorial I'm going to be making a night cityscape in Maya. And in the previous tutorials I've introduced a technique for modeling a city in Maya, and I'm going to bring up that technique and create a proper scene starting from modeling to rendering. So to get started, I need to create a road and basic environments, and we're going to use the same technique that I introduced in the previous tutorial. So starting from a plane, and before we subdivide this time I'm going to put more time into this to make this thing a bit more interesting. So I think I'm going to put a river in the middle of the city, but you can skip this part if you don't want a river in your city. So I just tweaked some of the edges in this mesh, and now I'm gonna bevel this to make an actual space between these edges. Now we can try to delete them by selecting the loop, and this can be a river. Now we're done with that. Now I'm going to try adding some roads, and I want the roads to be a bit irregular, so I'm just gonna use my knife tool to cut some of the roads. And before we do that, we can use a procedural way for randomizing some of these edges. It's not a perfect way to do this, but it sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add divisions first. Let me go to my attribute editor and add divisions manually. And each of these faces represents a block, and the edges will be the roads of the city. So keep that in mind and try to make a road network. So I'm just gonna add more divisions and try to reduce it to make it look more randomized. And as I said, it doesn't always work perfectly. We might have to add more subdivisions for it to work. Let me try adding more divisions, and triangulating it also helps randomizing it. So let me try to reduce it again. Probably reduce it by a little bit. I don't think it really works. So our other option would be doing it somewhat manually. It can be quite annoying, but we could use some help with the tools. So I can use transform underneath adding mesh, and we can use it for randomizing some of those vertices, by the way. I forgot to delete those vertices. Always remember to delete it by pressing Ctrl and delete, not just delete. Then the vertices are gone. Now I'm going to select every vertices and select transform and increase random value and try to transform it. You're going to see this cursor, and you can try to move it within X and Y, probably that's Z, Y and Z axis only. So you can just make it a bit irregular. And you could do it one more time by pressing G key. It's even more irregular this time. So we got this shape, and now we can use our knife tool to make it a bit more interesting. For instance, we can cut it diagonally to make this type of diagonal avenue. You can be creative. You can just draw your roads. And other example would be you could delete some of the edges. Something like that. Can be a bit more, so you get more interesting shaped blocks. And you can just keep on doing it. You could use your knife tool again, and you could just draw it like this. Of course, this type of cut is not that good for the procedural process, so you'll probably want to cut it clean like this. So after a few cuts, I'm going to move on to the next step. You just keep cutting that way, and I think that's enough. Now we're going to duplicate this one and maybe hide the original. Now we're gonna use the same method that I introduced in the previous tutorial. We can go to face selection mode and select everything and extrude it, and turn keep faces together off and add some offset. Something like that. And I think this width is enough. Something like that. And I'm going to invert selection, but sometimes it doesn't work. In this case, you can exit object mode. Your selection will remain. And try to delete history. and go back to face selection mode. And for some reason my selection's all gone. Yeah, let's try inverting the selection again. Doesn't work. In this case, could try to detach the selected parts and double click these parts, and probably we can just delete them, or we could just separate them for later use. And these two can be combined. Now we got these blocks, and we're gonna use them a lot, so we're gonna need a lot of duplication of this object. So let's delete history and duplicate like 3 times, and we're gonna do it one at a time. And now we can make this thing a bit more rounded in the corner. And to do that, select everything first, and we can extrude every edges downwards. And we can grow selection by pressing Shift and period at the same time. And we can bevel those edges for a bit more rounded shape. We can add more segments as well. Now we go around the corners. That's great. Now we also have to apply some materials. Before it's too late, and let's delete history before we do it. And probably this is going to be the pavement, so I'm just gonna call it AI pavement. Sorry, sidewalk. And we can again select everything and decrease selection. And you can do this by pressing Shift and comma at the same time. And we can extrude it again and add some offset. And those are gonna be our side work. And we can apply a new material for the inner block. And to make it more distinguishable, we can actually add a color to the shader. And now we got these. And we can try adding material to the ground plane, and this is basically gonna be the roads for the city. And for this I'm gonna give it a little dark gray color. And it looks not bad. And now we need some buildings for this empty city. And that's why I saved so many of this object. I'm going to isolate this object, and we're going to use our knife tool again to cut these blocks. And probably I'm going to delete some of the blocks, because there could be no buildings for some blocks, because they could be a park, or I don't know, something like a park. So you could just delete wherever you don't want buildings to be. And if you're done with that, we could try adding some subdivisions. And it's not always affecting in the same direction, so you might want to do it manually for some parts. I'm gonna give it 2 divisions for each direction, and now we can use our knife tool instead. So I'm gonna grab my knife tool again and try to cut something like that. It doesn't have to be perfect, because I'm trying to create a cityscape, not a open world game like GTA. So it is gonna be a rough cityscape. So forget about crazy details. I'm just trying to make an overall shape of a city. At least that's what I'm trying to do. So you can just keep on adding cuts like this, and each of these faces is gonna be a building. So you can try some more interesting shapes. I don't know. And we're gonna eventually end up with some landmarks in some spots, but I'm not quite sure. I'm going to decide after I finish with this and see the overall look of the city. And I'm going to make it quick. But you can spend as much time as you want. If you want more detail, you could even use your own models for buildings, but I don't have any at the moment, so I'm gonna use my procedural method for creating buildings for this city. And I'm going to select some of the blocks and subdivide them even further. Because some areas are more densely populated and some central areas tends to be more high-rise and the buildings are typically huge. So I'm gonna keep those blocks like that and subdivide these blocks even further. So I'm going to add more divisions, probably 2 more is enough. And yeah, I think that's enough. And let's try to extrude to make actual buildings. So we're gonna use the same method that I introduced in my other tutorials, and we could just try to scale it down like that, and it doesn't always work because some clipping is happening there. And I'm going to go with probably 0.05. I think some blocks are too small. I mean, some buildings are too small, but yeah, I think it's gonna work out. So we can invert selection again, but again, it does not work. Let's try escaping the edit mode and try it again. Now it works. We can delete the rest of them. And now we could select every faces of this object and extrude it. And I'm gonna start with this base height. Not too high, not too short. Probably 0.1 is enough for the base height. And I'm going to add some randomization for the height. And we can use the same transform component. Let's try it. I'm going to add a little variation to the heights of the buildings. And I think that's enough for our base setup. And there's actually a way to add more topology to the terrain, because this city is obviously perfectly flat and that's not too realistic. And I tried many ways to add some ups and downs to this flat terrain, but it is not perfect, and there's not a perfect solution yet to to do it procedurally. So when I figure it out, I'm going to make another tutorial about it. But now we're going to proceed with this flat city. And now I'm going to make some buildings taller. So probably I'm going to select some buildings in the central area. And let's try with these selected buildings. We can again use transform component and raise it up. I think that's too much. Just a little bit. If your machine lags a lot, you can try to type it in manually in local translate, in this case Z. Or is it Y? I'm not quite sure. I'm confused with Blender configuration. So anyways, probably we could add more buildings, more high-rise buildings. And I think I'm gonna select some smaller blocks, because I think those are too thick. And let's try with these one. Again, I'm using transform component. And this time I'm going to type in 0.6. And some residential buildings can be high-rise. So I'm going to select some of them. And this time I'm just going to raise it manually on my own. And you could just add as many details as you want. And probably you will have to delete some of the unwanted buildings, such as this one. This is an odd location for a building, so I'm just gonna delete that. Yeah, you could do that. Kind of thing. And I think I'm ready to move on to the next step. So I think it's time to finally save our scene. I'm just gonna call it city. And now we're going to assign materials for these building objects as well. I'm going to call it something like AI building. And I actually want different material for the rooftop. And you could just go to the side view and select everything except for the bottom parts of the buildings. And actually I want to get rid of the bottoms by inverting selection and deleting everything, because we won't be able to see them, so we can save some poly count by deleting them. And we can select everything again and decrease selection. Now we got every rooftop selected. And we can assign a new material like we did for other buildings. I mean other parts of the city. So I'm going to give it another color to make it distinguishable. And probably you can add more detail to the rooftop by extruding it and adding some offset. Not too much. And extruding it again. And adding some thickness. Probably negative 0.01 should be enough. So let me type in manually. And I'm going to assign a new material for the inner rooftop. So it's slowing down, but still manageable. So I'm gonna save it again. Alright. Let me delete history and let me assign another color to make it distinguishable again. Yeah, that's good. And actually we could make some bridges that connects the city to different city centers, and we could do it after we add some details to the edge of each city center. I mean edge of the river. And I'm going to select these edges and probably make it a bit wider. And probably extrude it like that. And we could probably assign a sidewall material for this one. And probably I'm going to extrude it again. Oops. I'm going to select the side only and extrude it again. And again, and yeah, that's it. And we're gonna do the same thing to the other side. Extrude it a little bit, but before we extrude it, we have to stretch it a little bit. And can apply the same material as we did. Oops. And select the edge of the river. And do the same thing we did to the other side. It seems a little blocky, but it can be fixed by beveling these edges. It might ruin topology, but yeah. We can do it later. And yeah, I think we're ready to add some bridges. So for bridges, I'm going to make a separate model. And it cannot be seamless. You can make it seamless, but it would take more time. So I'm just gonna use a separate model for the bridge. And there could be some clipping issue. And I think we can use the same technique as we did with the roads. We can bevel the edge to make a gap between those two edges. I'm gonna extrude this part again and apply some materials. Alright. Now I'm going to move it down like that. And we could probably cut it several times and add some curvature. And there's a bridge. I think it's too thick. Alright, that's enough. Now I'm going to use extrude tool for the actual supports of the bridge, and I think that's enough detail for now. But you can spend as much time as you want for the bridges and other assets. And let's add some water. Assign any material, and you can find the tutorial on making an animated water in 5 minutes or so in my channel. And let's assign a new material for the water as well. Give it a color, and that's it. Probably should change the color for the inner blocks. It's quite confusing. Probably red. Alright. I'm just gonna copy paste these bridges. Several times. And probably one more. Alright. And we're gonna place some street lights now and other small assets on the street. And yeah, I think we're ready for that. So for the street lights, I'm actually going to make it very simple because there's gonna be thousands of them and it takes up a lot of performances. So I just want to make it as simple as possible. Yeah. Let's give it a material, and I'm gonna extrude it once, and one more time to the side, and grow selection. And this is gonna be our straight light. I'm gonna call it AI emission. And yeah, we can actually add some emission now. And most importantly, you should relocate the pivot to the very bottom of the object. Now we're ready to place it using mesh. Alright. I think scale. I think this big is enough. Let's freeze transformation and delete history, clean up everything. And now we're gonna need another one of these block primitives. And this time, we're going to extrude it again and add some offset. Something like that. Let's do after adding some thickness. Let's delete it. And actually, let's do it after we bring these faces higher and add some offset. And we can delete that. And the bottoms. Now we got these rings. And we're gonna use this for our distribute information. We can add some divisions here. Only in U space. So each of these faces will have one street light. So considering that, maybe 4 or 5 would be enough. And it's not perfectly regular, but I think it is enough. And now we can delete history and center the pivot and freeze transformation. Now we're ready to distribute this street light, this little guy. So I'm going to go to Effect Workspace and go to Mesh Network and create a new mesh network with this mesh selected. And if you do that, you're going to see a multiple street lights created, and we have to change the distribution type to mesh, and we have our distribution mesh created already, so we have to drag it in to this input mesh with your middle mouse click. And let's see how it works. If we increase the number of points, and let's just see where they actually are. And I think they're in the wrong place. It sometimes happens. And we're gonna change the method to face center. So they're going to be placed on each faces. But I don't see it working at the moment. Or is it working? Let's see. see more clearly, we have to increase the number of points. Let's see, it has 8700 faces, so let's type in 80,000 roughly. And this is how it worked. Definitely did not work properly. Let me just break connection for a while and see if it matches. It matches quite well, but doesn't fit for some reason. I'm just going to try it again. This sometimes happens when the location of the input mesh and the actual mesh object is different. So let's make it the same. I'm just going to bring it to the very center of the grid. So let's hide everything except these two. And we could just move the pivot to the very center of the grid and move this guy to the center of the grid. And let's try it again. Can create a mesh network again and change the distribution type to mesh and import this mesh and increase the number of points to 8000. I don't think it's working properly still. Let me just try it again. This object is underneath the grid, so let me just bring it up a little bit. I'll relocate the pivot, and the location of the pivot is matching with this guy. It's quite important. And let's create another mesh network. Hopefully it works. And change the method to face center. Now if you take a look, I'm not quite sure. Change the vertex. Ah, I see. I think we can fix this by moving it to the left just slightly. So we can add a transform node. I'm not exactly sure why this happens, but yeah, let's try to fix it manually. So we can go to the top view and can turn on the wireframe override, and let's try to change the position a little bit. think it still doesn't really match. I think it's not just a problem of translation. I think it's off in many ways. Not quite sure why it happens, but it's truly annoying. I'm not quite sure why it's floating in the first place. Let's just delete this node. Let's see if we can find any other option. Let's try voxel and see how it actually deals with this. If we choose vertex, it seems it's working slightly better. It's still off a little bit. And choose flood mesh. Definitely no. Vertex works a bit better, so let's try this way. So going to the top view again, we're going to use another transform node. Try to fit this in. I think it's working, but it does not fit at all. Not quite sure why this happens, but it's truly annoying. Everything matches, and one last try. We're gonna try instance instead of mesh. I'm not quite sure if that's gonna make any difference, but let's see. how it actually works. I think it works better. Alright, I think it finally worked. So you can place it like that. Now it's a bit more interesting. Alright. We could place some trees using the same method, but I don't really have a tree model at the moment. And I think my machine won't be able to handle it. So enough details for me. So I'm going to move on to the next part, texturing. And before we texture these buildings, we have to UV unwrap it. And obviously this object is not very simple. It's quite sophisticated in terms of when it comes to UV mapping, especially. It's all separated. And yeah, it cannot be mapped manually, at least. So we're gonna use some automated solution. You can just do it by clicking this button right here. It will automatically unwrap the selected object. It's not perfect, but we're gonna see how it works. And make some edits to this. Obviously there are so many shells and they're very, very small. But if you apply some textures, for instance, let's say I'm gonna download some textures on YouTube. I mean Google, yeah. You can search for night building texture or whatnot. And you can find some good ones on Google. And seamless ones are better generally. And you could download multiple textures if you want more variation. And I think I'm gonna go with this one. I'm gonna save this image. And probably you wanna convert this image to PNG file or other file format, because Arnold does not support an image without an alpha channel if you want to use it as other maps other than albedo. So yeah, I'm gonna use that texture. Probably I have my own textures that I made a few years ago. So anyways, I'm gonna use that texture for demonstration. And if you go to AI building shader that we created, you're gonna see base and underneath that you're gonna see color. So you're gonna click on that icon and connect a file node, and we can import that image that we just downloaded and open that up. And you can click this icon to see how the texture is applied. And obviously we don't see much detail because each of the UV shells are too small, so they're kind of pixelated. You see the colors of the texture, but you don't see any details because they're basically zoomed in too much. So yeah, you just see a pixel of an image. So to fix that, you're gonna go to the file node again, and beside that you're gonna see place to the texture node, and you're gonna see repeat UV, and you can increase this number to repeat this texture multiple times, and you can increase this number until you see the details of the image. I'm gonna try 4,000. I think that's too much. Maybe 2,000. Again, keep changing this number to see whether it's working or not. I think it's not bad. Great. Let me just change the background color. And yeah, great. I'm gonna try to render this out now to see what it actually looks like. But yeah, we just checked out how it looks like in the viewport, so let's change the input of the shader. We actually should connect this to the emission color, not the base color. So we're gonna bring this in to emission color and increase emission weight. And probably we can keep the base color pretty dark and probably on a remove specular. But if you have a specular map, actually you can use this image as a specular map, but it's JPEG file, so you have to convert your image to a PNG file or any other file type that has an alpha channel, and you can use that as your specular map to make the windows a bit shinier, for example. Yeah, something like that. And it looks fine in the render view, but still a bit dull. We still can add more details quite quickly. For example, this road, we can use a procedural way to add some traffic lights or car lights using noise texture. And I'm going to increase emission weight, and we're going to connect something to this color input. And this time we're not going to use file, we're going to use noise. If you go there, you're going to see many things, but we want to decrease ratio first, and let's make these individual dots visible by decreasing density. And you could add some spottiness, and size randomization is quite important. And you could add some randomness. Follow type, probably smooth is the best option, and the depth does not affect this anymore. So we're gonna increase frequency now. And you could possibly animate this using this time input. And yeah, let's increase density a bit more and increase frequency instead. If we increase it too much, it will look like a little dot pattern. So I just wanna do a moderate. Just give it a moderate amount. So it sort of looks like cars in the street. And actually we should unwrap this again. It's quite distorted in some parts, so you go to UV session and you can do Planar Uv Unwrapping and from y-axis and project. Now the distortions are gone. Great. And I'm going to show you some other techniques to make the streets a bit brighter. And you can do it in the Hypershade again. We're going to go to Standard Surface 3. And we can have another noise texture. And we're going to connect this one instead this time, temporarily. Now we can do the same thing basically, decrease density, and this time add some spottiness, but a little size randomness, not like the last time, and probably decrease randomness just a little bit. And we can add frequency, but I want those dots to be a lot bigger than the last time. And probably we should decrease ratio. We don't need them, and decrease depth max, so we only see those same size dots. We could just make it slightly bigger, and maybe spottiness helps, some randomness in the brightness of streetlights, and it looks as if they're lit by those streetlights that we put on the sidewalk, although it's fake. You could change the fall-off to linear, smooth, fast, bubble. I think smooth is most natural. Alright, so we can add some color variation to this thing. Let's say default color a bit yellowish. Default color doesn't really affect anything, so you should change the color gain and looks pretty okay. Probably we can add increase depth max a little bit for more dots and decrease ratio for them to be faded out a little bit, and yeah, it looks a bit more sophisticated. Good. Now I'm gonna save the scene. Now we're gonna combine those two textures that we created, and if your previous texture is gone, you can find it in Textures tab. You can just middle mouse drag it into the node editor, and yeah, you can just select everything and click this button to bring all of the associated nodes. And I'm gonna type in layered texture to combine those two, and we can select it and middle mouse drag those two textures into the layer texture attributes, and we're gonna change the blend mode to multiply. Let's do that. Maybe add is better. Yeah. And those dots, the color of the small dots can be changed by adding a ramp node, ramp texture, and another layer texture. So we're gonna have this layer texture in this layer texture node. But before we do that, let's bring in noise texture and the ramp texture into our new layer texture node, and the ramp texture should be on top. And we're gonna to multiply this time, and in the ramp node we're going to put in some colors we want, maybe red for the car light, and some bright orange, and green for the street light, traffic light, and probably some yellow as well. Now we're gonna connect this to this layer texture input, and we're gonna delete noise 1 and bring this new one, and let's see how it's affected. It is affected, but it's too regular. We want this thing to be a bit more randomized, so we can add some noise. Basically, this is the simplest way probably, and increase frequency, and also you could add some color noise to make the colors more randomized. And if you think the lights are too bright, you could go to layer texture and decrease alpha to make them a bit more visible. Now go back to the actual shader. Let's increase emission weight, and let's see how it appears in the render view. It looks like that. Okay, maybe we need to tweak the colors a bit. Maybe you could take a look at some reference photos. Alright, now we're going to use the same technique for the buildings. We want to randomize the color of the lights of the building. So again, back to the building material. And we can have a layer texture and the ramp node. We can bring in both textures into the layer texture node. And the ramp should be on the very left. And let's change the blend mode to multiply. And probably light yellow and probably sky blue and white and a little greenish, light green, and probably a bit deeper blue. I think that should be enough. Let's replace it. Replace the original one and let's see how it's affected. Again, we have to randomize this ramp texture a bit, increase frequency. Now you immediately see the colors a bit randomized. And probably you want some buildings to be off all the way. Then you can add some black like that. You immediately see some buildings are going darker. You can make this area a bit bigger for more blacked out buildings. That's it. Now let's assign any material to the water. And the color probably black. Specular, 0 roughness. Transmission 0, emission 0. What matters is the bump mapping here on the geometry section. And we're gonna use noise texture again for the bump map. And this time we're gonna use pearly noise. And we actually have to see it in the render view because it's not really visible in the viewport. I think we need a light. Let's have an area light temporarily. That should be enough. We just increase intensity and exposure. We start to see some details of water. And obviously we need to increase frequency like that. And we should decrease depth as well. 0.001, so we can see the lights reflected on the water. Let's see how it looks on the ground level. Okay. I think rows are too reflective, so let me decrease specular weight and increase roughness. Probably not quite sure. Let's increase the exposure a little bit. See how it appears in the render view. Alright, it looks like a water. I think that's enough. And let me just reset that. And this building is off, by the way. That should not happen. You can just tweak this texture to, you know, make some buildings appear. There we go. Right. Now we have to assign textures for the sidewalk and roof and other areas. I think this tutorial is getting too long, so I think I'm gonna end this tutorial after rendering this out and do some post-processing. So it's very bright. So I'm going to find a nice spot for the final render. Let's create another camera. and put it in the frame. And I think somewhere like this would be nice. The horizon is not filled out, so the view is quite limited, but we still can find the perfect spot. It's quite difficult. Get everything in one frame. So let's try this angle. Alright. Actually, you could add metalness and decrease roughness to see some reflections on the surface. That could make it more realistic, but every building is like glasses, so that's why we need specular map. Let's keep it this way. I think it looks nice. I think the sidewalk is too narrow, and there's still lots to be fixed. I think you learned a lot of techniques in this tutorial for making a city like this in a very short time. Yeah, let's scale this UV shell. Actually, it took longer than I thought, because the mesh didn't work properly. But I think we got it. We just scale them down and finish this tutorial. So I recommend using this walk tool you can find underneath camera tools and walk tool. You can also adjust some settings. I didn't realize this city is so small. In terms of, Maya's distant units. We have to slow down the walk speed to make it manageable. You can zoom in or out by scrolling your mouse, scrolling up or down. It actually changes the focal length, not moving the camera, so it can be quite useful when you're framing your scene. just want to get as much as I can in one frame. So what about an aerial shot? Maybe something like that. Not quite sure. Alright, something like that. And press escape key to finish, and yeah, I think it's not bad. But apparently we lack some details in the close-up parts. So I think we could make use of depth of field. Right. Maybe focal length of 30 looks nice. And depth of field works nice with higher focal length. So yeah, I'm gonna keep it this way. And yeah, probably something like that. Maybe I'll delete that guy. There's nothing much I can do now. Let's try to render this out. And I'll bring up the water. Bring up the water for it to capture more light. I don't think there is getting any. Let's see what we can do about it. I think it's because of the angle. Doesn't really reflect any light. From this angle, it does slightly. Okay. Alright, let's finish it by adding some depth of field. You can scroll down to Arnold in your camera shape node and enable DOF, which stands for depth of field. Let me just pause the rendering. And focus distance, probably 12, 10 is enough because this scene is quite small. So 10, and aperture size, probably 0.3. Let's try 0.3. And let's see how it works. Okay, that's quite heavy depth of field. And maybe we should decrease the number. 0.1. Okay. I actually want to do something about the river before I finish. Maybe you can add some lights underneath the bridges. Let's try this one. I'll go back to my original camera and add this area light underneath the bridge. We kind of see the bridge glowing. And we can finally tell that there's water. There's actually water. Okay. Probably too bright. Maybe you can tweak the color. Like blue. And I want to tweak the water setting a little bit. Okay. Maybe a bit more frequency. Or deeper depth. Try 0.001 and the frequency should be something like that. Okay. I think that's nice. We see slight a bit of reflection, but not by much. Yeah, I think that's enough. So we're gonna go to render settings now and change the resolution. Maybe 1080p, probably 720p is enough for me. And increase camera samples and transmission. We don't really have transmission in this scene, so let's just get rid of it. No volumes. You could add some volume if you want. That's good for realism. But I'm not going to use any. And probably diffuse and specular, that's all. And what really matters is the AOVs. I'm going to add we don't really need RGBA. The denoiser has been moved to imager. We need emission, and I think that's all. So we can try to render this out in a full resolution. It's gonna take some time, so I'll be back when it's done. Now the rendering seems to be done, and you could try some new imager feature added on Arnold 6.2. I think this lens effect could be useful in this case. With this lens effect imager post-processing node, you can add bloom. And it's actually not a very fast solution, but I think it's still processing. Okay, my piece is not fast enough, but if your machine is powerful enough to run this imager, it is worth trying. And yeah, I'm just gonna disable this and save this as an image file. I'm just gonna call it beauty.png, and we actually have another AOV, so let's go to emission. You barely notice difference, but if you take a closer look, you see the reflections are gone. So I'm just gonna save it as well. I'm just gonna call it emission.png. I'm just gonna bring it to Photoshop. We could import these two images. And actually I'm gonna copy and paste here, and this emission AOV can be useful when you're adding bloom effect on your bloom effect manually. So for instance, we can change the blend type to screen and it gets brighter, and we can add a blur filter to this layer only, and you can see it's kind of glowing effect. So you could just add a little bit and decrease opacity. There could be some other ways to extract those bright spots. For instance, you could duplicate the original image and go to image and adjustments. You could use curves or levels to extract the bright spots. Something like that. You just bring out some of those brightest areas, and you could do the same. Change the blend mode and add a blur filter. Could be Gaussian blur, or maybe even motion blur works nice. We'll try motion blur. Just a little bit. So it kind of looks like a fake lens flare effect. It's not perfect though. On top of that, I'm gonna add a little bit of this. Let me just decrease opacity. You can kind of see the difference. So with everything done, I'm just gonna combine every layers and do some color correction maybe. I'm gonna use camera roll filter. You could change the color temperature. It really depends on your own taste. This will bring us out the reflection, so let's increase clarity. And bring some shadows. You can make it a bit more saturated or desaturated. I think this is enough. Maybe desaturate it a little bit. And a bit cooler temperature. Okay, I think it wraps up this tutorial, and that could be a lot more to do. You could use some of the techniques that I introduced today to populate more assets to the scene. For example, you could populate some more objects and details on the rooftops of the building, or you could add some trees on the street, and you could do more detail work on the roads. This tutorial was a bit confusing, but yeah, this is the result anyways. Yeah, I think it took almost 2 hours, and not a short time, but creating this type of huge environment in 2 hours, I think it is quite useful technique, and I hope it was useful for your work, or at least inspirational. And thank you for watching this tutorial. Maybe you can share your work or leave a comment. I always welcome a feedback. So yeah, thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you around.